China is the EU's largest trade partner. They have just surpassed the US. And you would think that this would be huge news. And in the Chinese media, it was, but I found a very hard time finding an article about this in the West. But I did. I managed to find this article by Politico. China topples US as EU's top trade partner over 2020. And if you go through the article, they say that it was the pandemic that severely hit transatlantic trade. And they describe the EU's trade with China, in which China enjoys a surplus, which only makes sense because China has a massive industrial base. COVID-19 might have helped accelerate this process, but I think everyone understands that China is eventually going to surpass the US economically. And maybe over the next couple of years, the US and China will trade places as the EU's largest trade partner. But eventually China is going to pull ahead. And why shouldn't they? They have a larger population. They have the same population as the US, plus over an extra billion more people. They have access to plenty of resources and they have a well-developed industrial base. It is inevitable that China is going to surpass the United States economically. And for the United States to say that that is unacceptable and that they are going to stop that from happening is an irrational and dangerous policy. And how is the US planning to stop China from surpassing it economically? Through constructive competition? Examining America's economic fundamentals and fine-tuning them? No. They've resorted to a trade war. They are using sanctions. They are engaged in political subversion both inside China, in places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Tibet, and all along China's peripheries in places like Southeast Asia. The anti-government mobs here in Thailand are backed by the US government. They're trying to get a Chinese-friendly government out of power and put a client regime into power that will pivot Thailand back towards the West. Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar was doing the exact same thing. The military has ousted her. There are now mobs in the streets to try to reverse that. Those mobs are being backed by the US government. So we can see how the US is destabilizing the globe. It's not stopping China from surpassing it. And at the same time, this is starting to blow back to the US itself. Think about it. Companies like Huawei, a smartphone manufacturer, was surpassing its American counterparts. Instead of the US competing constructively with Huawei, they decided to start cutting Huawei off, not only from US markets, but putting pressure on other countries to cut Huawei off from their markets as well. The US is no longer allowing companies to sell components to Huawei. Huawei will find those components from somewhere else, and in the long term, they will figure out how to manufacture them as well. China and Huawei will still outcompete their Western counterparts, and now the West will get no benefit as those companies rise. The exact same thing is happening with COMAC. This is a company in China that manufactures commercial airliners. Now they pose no threat to Boeing or Airbus, but in a few years, maybe they will. So what has the US done? Put sanctions on COMAC. COMAC was buying components from the US. They can no longer do that. In the short term, they will find those components from somewhere else. In the long term, they will learn how to manufacture them themselves. China has the largest airline industry in the world. Because of what the US is doing to China right now, China can easily justify freezing companies like Boeing out of China's domestic airliner markets. That would give COMAC the ability to grow in a gigantic market. And by the time that they've fully expanded and proven their aircraft reliable, they will already be at a scale large enough to compete with Boeing and Airbus internationally anyway. And again, the West will get absolutely nothing out of the rise of COMAC. We can see that US policy doesn't even actually serve America's best interests. We can see how it's not working. We can see that China is inevitably going to surpass the US, and because of the current policy of the US, they're not even going to get any benefit out of it, and they're going to be left in a place where they're still going to have to figure out how to constructively find a place within the world rather than imposing themselves upon the world. That is still a process that's going to happen. The sooner they can start on that process, the better it will be for America as a whole. The longer they wait to do that, the more damage they're going to do, not just to the US, but also to the stability and peace and prosperity of the entire planet. The world needs to start thinking about how things are going to look in the future. They need to start to understand the concept of the multipolar world and the importance of maintaining balance within that world, so we don't just have China trade places with the US and just become the next abusive hegemon. We need to make sure that there is a healthy balance. The US could contribute to that balance, but right now they cannot. Start thinking about countries like Russia, countries like India. Start thinking about building alliances with your neighbors. Start thinking about diversifying that way within Eurasia. Stop thinking about the US until they can find a constructive way to engage with the world. That said, there might be some companies in the US who do have a constructive outlook, who have a way of looking at the world that is not necessarily what we see in Washington or on Wall Street. I would suggest countries reach out to those companies individually rather than to the US as a whole. To my Patreon patrons who make these videos possible on a day-to-day basis, thank you so much for your support. Check the video description for the link to this article, as well as 2 links of ways you can help support my work, like by becoming a Patreon member. Please like and share the video if you thought it was useful. And as always, thank you for watching.